Hello, this is Pastor Bill Burks. This is a reproduction of a sermon given back in May. The recording device was not working on the day this sermon was given. The sermon is entitled Seafoam Religion. It is based on a paragraph in the Hebrew text. It is based in Hosea chapter 10, verses 1 through 8. Now, in looking at these passages, I came up with some initial questions. How committed are you to God? Where's your heart in relationship to where it should be? You must choose. God does not like mixed religion. God will not put up with divided loyalty. The passage that we have for today is Hosea chapter 10, verses 1 through 8. It says, Israel is an empty vine. He bringeth forth fruit unto himself. According to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased the altars. According to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. Their heart is divided. Now they shall be found faulty. He shall break down their altars. He shall spoil their images. For now they shall say, We have no king, because we feared not the Lord. What then should a king do to us? Verse 4. They have spoken words, swearing falsely in making a covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. The inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the cows or the calves of Bethaven. For the people thereof shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof rejoiced on it. For the glory thereof, because it's departed from it. Verse 6. It shall also be carried unto Assyria for a presence to King Jareb. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. As for Samaria, her king is cut off as the foam upon the water. The high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and thistle shall come upon their altars. And they shall say to the mountains, Cover us, and to the hills, Fall on us. Well, the first thing we see in this passage, in verses 1 and 2, is that prosperity in Israel brought forth heresy. Let's look at the word translated in King James as empty. Now, there are two different roots in the Hebrew for becha. The first of these means empty, as is translated in the King James Version. It should be noted, however, that there is a second root which means luxuriant. And this is really the opposite meaning of being empty. As one writer put it, luxuriant means elaborate, marked by complexity and richness of detail. Other translations, such as the New American Standard Bible, use the word luxuriant. This rendering is also supported by the Septuagint translation into Greek of the book of Hosea. Israel had prospered in the land. Clearly, this is what is indicated by the second phrase in verse 1. It says, according to the multitude of his fruit, he hath increased altars. Israel was prosperous, but this prosperity caused them to turn away from God. The multitude of their altars was not a good thing. The phrase has to do with their idolatry. Now, when you think about it, it brings the question of, is the multitude of churches and places of worship, the tolerance for other religions and idols and their worship, is it a good thing in America? Judah, who later followed them in their idolatry, is chastened by Ezekiel. In Ezekiel chapter 6, verse 13, it says, "Then shall ye know that I am the Lord, when their slain men shall be among their idols, round about their altars, upon every high hill, in the tops of mountains, and upon every green tree, and under every thick oak." The place where they did offer sweet savor to all their idols. The next phrase in this passage shares a parallel idea. It says, according to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. By the same measure as their bounty of increase in the produce of the land, they increased their idols. For our first 200 years as a nation, we prospered in America. As we have prospered, we have also increased our places of worship. Our tolerance for different ideas has led us to encourage the ideas of Eastern religions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, and other religions also increase and have gained a foothold in our land. These ideas have infected our views of God and the Bible. We have modified our religious views to accommodate what others believe and teach. This is a pantheon of religious views which find their acceptance in our society. Now, don't get me wrong, I have enjoyed the fruits of religious freedom. I am glad that we have the freedoms we do have today. I see, however, that these freedoms are being eroded by government intrusion. The erosion is caused by the reaction of our people to some of the more dangerous elements of the religious practice of some. We are caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to keeping order in our society and the chaos caused by the cultic ideas of some. We find that in trying to relieve the burdens of our society, people have turned to drugs and alcohol and unseemly sexual deviancy to find some spiritual high. Some of our states are ready to make the use of marijuana and other drugs legal, or to decriminalize them. The use of intoxicants for relief of the stresses of our world has become a form of worship. We may want to take note of what happened to Israel in Hosea. The increase of our altars, the worship of other gods, which are not God at all, the increase of our worship of nature is not good, nor is the rejection of God as creator by those who follow the ideas of atheism or Darwinism. These are not of God. These teachings of the modern age are a form of religious ideas. Their adherents are just as dedicated to their rejection of God as the Christian should be of his acceptance of God and his following of God. Their defense of these views are done from the altars of colleges and society. They form false worship, just as ancient Israel did in their worship of idols of silver and gold and stone. Our nation is suffering right now. We have immigration problems. We have financial problems. We have wars in diverse places in the world. We cannot seem to overcome these issues. Now, whether these current crises are the result of the sin of idolatry, I don't know. But what I do know is that one day these sins will destroy our nation. These sins can also destroy our personal lives. What we as individual Christians must do is avoid the traps of prosperity. We must reject the idea of false religions. We must reject their idols, their forms of worship. We should be praying for our friends and neighbors and loved ones who have bought into these ideas. We should be careful to reject these views that we have adopted in our own lives. We need a revival in our lives, a return to the roots of our faith. Now, the sin of idolatry causes a division of loyalty. We find this in verse 2. Their heart is divided. Now shall they be found faulty. He shall break down their altars. He shall spoil their images. Remember, the gods of the land were called the Baalim or Belim. They were the lords or masters. During New Testament times, Christ warned the people concerning the worship of money. He says, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. He says this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Today we are asked by our society to tolerate and even embrace religious views that we believe will lead to the eternal destruction of their adherents. We are discouraged from evangelizing. Some believe that teaching the Christian religion is too radical and creates hard feelings. Some believe that the ideas and the teachings of Jesus should be stopped. They want Christians to modify their message to a message of inclusion, that want to promote the idea that I'm okay, you're okay, is dangerous. They want to stop the evangelizing of others in public. Now, I understand some of their concerns. I feel that the preaching of some on the public airwaves is not scriptural and even dangerous to the weak. However, the protections given by the founding fathers were put there into the Constitution. We have a right, we have been given a right for all in this land to worship as they see fit. So no matter how offensive I would find the preaching of some, I cannot condone the removal of our freedoms. False religious ideas cause us to have division in our loyalty. You can't worship God and follow these ideas, these false ideas as well. You will love one and you will despise the other. Now, the second major point in this passage is found in verses 3 through 6. The sin of idolatry leads to judgment, and judgment leads to suffering. As a result of the sin of Israel, God will bring judgment. This judgment brings, in verse 3, the loss of leadership. Their false worship has caused a deadly vine to grow in their land, hemlock, according to verse 4. And of course, we all know the story of the ancient Greek philosopher who drank hemlock in suicide. Hemlock is a deadly vine. This deadly vine grew in their midst because they allowed this false worship to flourish. Number 3, the loss of their glory is because of their false worship, and this glory will depart, according to verse 5. Now, the fourth point is their gifts to false gods will be gifts to the kings that oppress them. And lastly, their false worship will be taken away. The prosperity will be taken away. And this is painful. When we think about these penalties that ancient Israel suffered as a result of their sin, we should consider carefully in our lives and in the lives of those we love what the cost will be. The third major point in this passage is God will destroy their false worship, and we find this in verses 7 and 8. Israel's leaders are compared to sea foam. This is meaningless. They shall be utterly cut off, according to verse 7. Now, sea foam is not only meaningless or useless, but it could also be dangerous. As one of my members in the church informed me, that sea foam is where all of the poisons and bad things in the sea rise up and bubble out, is in that sea foam. It's going to be utterly cut off. The objects and places of false worship will be destroyed and become useless places like those that only grow thorns and thistles, according to verse 8. Think about it. There are beautiful places in our country. Some of them are the places of worship. If that worship is false worship, it is meaningless, and it is somewhat dangerous, and it is also going to eventually be destroyed by God. Destroyed by God and become a place of desolation. Now, this has been a shorter sermon than most that I have given recently. So in conclusion, I'd like to say this. False worship is destructive in our lives. It causes us to be divided in our loyalty. It causes us to hate and loathe God and His ways. We must get rid of false worship in our lives or God will. We need to commit to God and to be loyal to Him. If we don't, we are like sea foam, useless, and will be cut off. We should pray for those that we know and love, that God will change their hearts, will show them the error of their ways, that they will cease their evil practices. We must do that in our lives as well. Reject the false teachings of this world and come to Christ and to God for our religious practice. The place we find that is the Word of God and in the worship of the only true God.